In this video, I describe not only what it takes to make a slatted bench that is suitable for outdoors, but also describe one of the most terrifying glue up experiences I've ever had that produced this sound and worried me enough to go get safety goggles in order to finish the glue up because I was honestly just afraid that this thing was going to more or less explode on me. Now, because this bench was going to be outside, sitting in the grass, getting beat up by the sun, by the weather, by children, by wildlife, birds, whatever. I mean, within the first week, it got hailed on. So, like knowing this, going into this, knowing that things like this were going to happen, I went with really cheap lumber. Like I didn't want to make something fancy. At my local box store, at my local home center, there's a section of lumber where they spray it with purple paint, and it just signifies something's wrong with these boards. They can't sell it, and they sell it at a heavily discounted rate. So I picked up 14 or 15 1x3s, and many of them were just heavily warped, which I knew going into it. This one in particular, looking along the length of it, just you can see just how warped it is. I wasn't super concerned because once you chop it up, the warp gets smaller and smaller, while other boards just had long splits that I'll show you how it addressed later on. But the very first thing that I did was I was going to be out of town for a few days, so I decided one way I can try and remedy some of these splits is just to try and glue them up, put glue within that split area and clamp them together. This ended up working okay. It was more of an experiment on my end. At worst, what it did was just make these boards a little bit safer to handle because some of them were split so much that I was afraid they were going to just tear in half under their own weight if I mishandled them. But yeah, they did help hold the boards together while I was able to continue working with them and cut them into smaller pieces. But I will also describe what I did to make them even stronger later on in this video. Now I wanted to run all these boards through my thickness planer so that I could get a consistent thickness with all my boards, but all of them had staple tags at the very end. And I just wanted to remove those staples. I didn't want to risk chipping my planer blades. It's just not worth it. It takes 2 minutes to remove all these staples. And so that's what I did with all these 1x3s. Once the staples had been removed, then what I wanted to do is run all of my boards through the thickness planer. And my goal here wasn't to remove any kind of warping or any kind of cupping or anything like that. My goal was to make all of these boards a consistent thickness despite the warping that they ultimately have, because I'm making a slatted bench. So the slatted bench the top of it is slatted, the legs are slatted. The way that the top and the legs combine together are they have complementary slats that they interchange with together. And so what I wanted to be able to do is treat all boards as interchangeable, meaning I didn't want to have to keep track in my head which one of these boards is a little bit thicker, which one is a little bit thinner, and just complicate the glue up process or the assembly process. So in order to avoid that, making all boards the same thickness really does a lot to simplifying the assembly. With these boards at a consistent thickness, now I can get a general sense for how deep the bench is going to be. So I press them together, I clamp them together, measure it. They're about a 10 1/4 inches deep. And if you double that, because if you have to count for the slats, this entire bench is going to be about 20 1/2 inches deep. So once I'm done with my planer, I swap it out for my miter saw, and in this next step, I'm making the rough cuts for all of the boards or all the pieces within this bench. There's the leg pieces, there are the top pieces running across the top of the bench, and then there are smaller pieces that are the slats that go within the slats between all of the boards. Now, in this step, I cut the leg pieces first because that's where I'm most opinionated about the length of the boards. I didn't want to get into a situation where I cut the top boards too wide and now I'm stuck with leg pieces that have to be too short because I cut the top too wide. And so I didn't want this bench ultimately sitting too low to the ground. I decided to start with how tall do I want this bench? I want it to be between 18 and 19 inches tall. From that, the top of the bench will be as wide as whatever I have left there, minus any pieces that go into the slats. And here you can see all of the pieces that are rough cut to their approximate size. The top boards are the long ones, the legs are the slightly shorter ones, and then the really short boards are the spacers that go inside of the slats for both the top and the leg pieces. Now I'm just about ready for the glue up. Before going into the glue up, I choose an A and a B side. So this means what's going to be my show side and get all those boards aligned together. Some of these boards have knots on them. I didn't want those to be on top. I wanted those to be on the bottom. But once I have all the boards oriented correctly, now it's time to start assembling the top and the legs. I mentioned earlier a lot of the boards were, yes, they were warped, but they were also split. And I mentioned that I put glue in those splits and clamped them together with the hopes of just seeing, how well that would address the split. Honestly, as a result, I wasn't convinced that that would make those boards strong at the end of the day. I wasn't comfortable having a grown adult or two grown adults sitting on the bench with those splits. And this is where these spacers kind of serve a dual purpose. So yes, those spacers create space and create a slatted look for this bench, but I can also position these spacers to be not next to the strong part of the board, but I can put them or position them on top of those cracks so that they effectively hold the entire board together. So this is what I did with the entire top and the legs, as well as I strategically positioned those spacers where I thought the board needed to be reinforced. And this actually had a convenient side effect of making the top look somewhat asymmetric in a good way. Like it ended up being a pretty nice design at the end of it. So here's the thing about assembling a bench in this way. So just one board at a time on what you think is a flat surface. Like, so you can't assume that as a result of doing this, it's going to be flat enough to be comfortable on top of that bench. So what I wanted to do is run this bench top through my planer. In order to run it through my planer, I had to constrain this to be two separate pieces that were no more than 13 inches deep. And so I created two pieces that were less than 13 inches deep, and I let the glue dry. And once the glue was dried and cured on those pieces, and then including on the leg pieces as well, I flipped over to my planer and I ran both pieces, both pieces for the top and all four pieces for the legs through the planer. This gave the top and the legs a consistent thickness, and once those pieces have a consistent thickness, then I can glue the two halves together, and now it'll be a much more comfortable top because the top is more or less flat between the two halves. Next, it's time to take this bench top and take the rough cut width boards and get them down to a consistent thickness. I was originally going to try this with my table saw. This ended up being a little bit too unwieldy. I mean, the blade doesn't go up quite high enough, and it's just I didn't feel safe using my miter slot or my miter gauge to run this past the table saw blade. So I ended up abandoning this strategy with my table saw, and instead I got out just a circular saw, a straight edge, and made an initial cut. My circular saw couldn't get deep enough, so I just finished the job with a Japanese pole saw, and this got the edges flat enough um, for this bench. Again, I'm going to chalk this up to, my intent for this board or my intent for this bench isn't to make this, amazingly perfect and neat and detailed. This thing is going to get beat up. I don't mind having, somewhat rough edges here. Um, but yeah, I wanted it to get pretty close. Now we get to what ends up being a fairly stressful and worrisome glue up. And we'll get to those details in a minute here. First thing I do is I put a couple of quarter-inch spacers on the bottom, and I'm going to glue this bench upside down. The reason why I have those spacers is because I'm going to insert the legs, again, upside down into the top, and I want the legs to protrude through about a quarter of an inch because those legs were rough cut. And so I'll come back later after the fact and use a Japanese pole saw and use a sander and just get the what will be the top ultimately flush. I also get some of my offcuts and use them as spacers to hold these boards to be more straight. These boards are still a little bit warped, and I'm about to insert 14 or 15 warped boards into 14 or 50 other warped boards. And in order to help make this process go a little bit more smoothly, I put those offcut spacers in there so that they just hold a little bit more straight. This was a fairly lost cause, but hey, I thought it was a good idea at the time. And here begins my mistake. I am using Titebond 3 glue and I'm putting glue on both sides of all these boards on the legs just before I insert them into the bench top. And I can't remember, Titebond 3 has maybe 20 minutes of open time, maybe it's 30 minutes. Whatever the open time is, I am not moving fast enough for this glue up. And this is going to cause me problems in a moment here because the glue is going to start curing during a glue up that's already has quite a bit of friction because I'm trying to insert 15 boards into 15 other boards that are very tightly spaced. All the boards are more or less warped, and the glue is curing all the while. This is a problem. Before we get to the really fun part of the video, I guess it's important to remember in our project, there is an A side and there's a B side to our project, at least in this project, on this particular piece. I planned for there being a show side and a side I don't want to be shown. And here I am realizing I have this upside down. So I'm glad I caught this. And I turn this around so that the tops, what will be the top side, flips over to the bottom side of this glue up. And here we go. Now it's time to see this one leg going into the bench top. There are 14 individual boards on that leg. There are 15 individual boards on the bench top, and they need to slide next to each other and get glued basically next to each other. My plan was to slide them in next to each other at a 90-degree angle and then clamp them from the outsides and just hold that pressure there and just hold them at that 90-degree angle while the glue cured. But this was such a disaster because it took me so long to try and get the leg inserted into the bench top, and there's just so much friction with these warped boards. The all the while the glue is curing on me and causing even more friction. I mean, just have a listen to some of these noises that this bench is making. And it's around this point I'm mentally thinking, nope, something's not right. The sounds that I'm hearing here, they just give me the intuition of, I've got a lot of force being applied with these clamps. This sounds like wood that it sounds like it's about to break. It sounds like it's about to burst. Um, I stepped away for a minute. I put on some safety goggles because honestly, I wasn't sure what was about to happen. Maybe I was clamping it in an uneven way, and this thing was just about to burst at the seam. I didn't know what was going to happen, and it was making me pretty scared just hearing these noises. Eventually, I was able to get that first leg exactly where it needed to be at a nice 90-degree angle from the top. I still had one more leg to go. I thought to myself, there's no way I'm going through all that again. So I decided no glue for the second leg. That allowed me to get it inserted within about 5 minutes, which was great. It allowed me to get it squared up with the top really easily because it was still easy to manipulate. That was great. I popped in a couple screws on both sides to lock it in at least from the sides. That went well too, but I also thought, there's not a lot of support in the middle, so I ended up grabbing a couple pieces of scrap pressure treated lumber and glued that on the bottom, and that gave me a little bit more confidence that this was going to hold on both sides. And then as part of the finishing process, I did a spray on shellac, but specifically for the legs have exposed end grain that sit directly on potentially wet ground. And in order to mitigate any potential for rot or anything like that, what I decided to do was paint those legs. So a base coat of exterior paint, and then spray on polyurethane, and that will help block out moisture and prevent that moisture from seeping up into the end grain. But yeah, there it is, an exterior bench for under $20. My name's Charlie. I'm with Measure Twice Woodworking. Thanks for watching.